For increasing numbers in the Jewish community, Shmita practice is emerging as a compelling part of our tradition that we can learn from in this moment. But it's part of the Christian tradition too. So I'm excited about this potential for some shared conversations. In Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 to 11, describe one of the major components of Shmita practice, which is rest for the land. Quote, "For 6 years, you are to sow your land and to gather in its produce. But in the 7th, you are to let it go and to let it be, that the needy of your people may eat, and what remains, the wildlife of the field shall eat," end quote. In a way, this mirrors the weekly Sabbath. Like for 6 days we work, and on the 7th we rest. Here, though, in the practice of Shmita, the focus is more on the land than on the people. For 6 years, the land is worked, and on the 7th, the land is let go or released. And actually, that's what Shmita means in Hebrew, release. So, Pastor and Rabbi, I'm interested to know what might jump out for you about this part of the Shmita practice.
Do you want to go first?
Oh, if I go first, we won't stop. I won't stop talking. So I want to make sure that, you know.
Yeah. No, Yaira, thank you for that question. So where my mind goes when I think about this, especially from an African-American culture perspective, is that there is a history of sharecropping in the stories of African-Americans. And so although I didn't have the opportunity to participate in that type of vocation, I do understand that we, as an African-American people coming from the times of slavery, that was a way that many of our people learned to cultivate their own land, to make a living, and to do those type of things. So even here in the city of Austin, where we are, the historic St. John's District Association area is an area that when it was first claimed or first provided to African Americans, the plots were given to those who were sharecroppers. And so it was interesting how we developed those agricultural practices. And I believe that, to the best as I understand it, is that some of those practices would still be done back then, where people understood that the land needed to rest so that it would have an opportunity to produce for the next year. And so moving forward into current times, what I would say is that since many people are not sharecroppers or farmers or anything anymore, I think it has kind of transitioned to the place, especially in the church, where we understand the need for people to have basic needs met. And so for churches that do have enough property, you're now beginning to see churches that are planting gardens and teaching people to be agricultural, to be able to live off the land. Again, if I can mention this, the St. John District Association here in Austin, there's actually a church, the Rehoboth Baptist Church, who has taken the primary responsibility that now there's a garden there at St. John where they're actually planting, and they have an incredible harvest that comes from that every year, but they're using that to feed the community. They're using that to provide those goods to other churches. And so I think that there is still the idea of where this comes from. But again, just because of how times has changed and you don't have a lot of agricultural people in the church anymore, I don't necessarily see it as a common practice, but I do see it in different ways where food is a concern, the climate is a concern. And so how can we feed ourselves? How can we live off the land? And how can we use that to help support other people, again, who have food insecurity or other methods like that?
Thank you. I love that.
Sorry about that. I just started Zoom last week, so I'm still learning. So.
It's okay. There's a curve. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point. And I appreciate you contextualizing it in a particular community and culture and ways that resonates. You know, for me, if you're looking at Exodus chapter 23, this is after the moment that the children of Israel were able to begin to coalesce as a people. So at this moment, I think that the Torah is telling us that there is a corrective in the book of from the book of Genesis. Just like God, or we would say in Hebrew, Hashem, would have offered a particular point of land and a point of perspective in the Garden of Eden. And I think much of this runs up against, you shall have dominion over the earth, as it is perhaps imparted to Adam and Eve. Now, I think with a bit of experience, as has been the case in the Hebrew Bible, that there's a bit of a shift. You know, God has learned the boundaries and the barriers of Adam and Eve, and let's say Noah and the flood. And now later on with the Exodus from Egypt, God is saying, you are not, and you do not have dominion over the earth. Rather, the earth is the Lord's, as it says in Psalms. And you are in fact part of a larger system, a larger ecosystem, a larger rhythm of how this world, your world, functions. So rather than us think about it as what can everything, plants, beasts, and everything else do for us as human beings, here I think God is saying, recognize a larger perspective. And just like you have begun to practice the spiritual practices of the Sabbath, know too that that carries into every other aspect of your life. So do you have faith in me enough to let the land lie and rest for a year? And I think that that kind of challenge is an incredible challenge. And it's something that I think in every generation, we get to decide how much we're up to that challenge. So very much as Reverend Horton was suggesting, that we're providing food and the land is providing food. But we have to understand too that underneath all of that, ultimately God provides for us, and that we shouldn't take that partnership or that sense of obligation of the land for granted in our lives.